The shadows of history hold secrets that most people never learn about. While names like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer dominate the headlines, there exists a darker underworld of killers whose crimes were just as brutal, just as calculated, and just as terrifying. These are the predators who slipped through the cracks of public memory, the monsters who operated in plain sight while the world looked elsewhere. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on 5 of the most evil serial killers you've probably never heard of. Their stories will chill you to the bone and leave you questioning how such darkness can exist unnoticed in our world. David Berkowitz terrorized New York City for over a year, but his story begins long before he became the nightmare known as the Son of Sam. Born Richard David Falco on June 1st, 1953, he entered the world as an unwanted child, immediately given up for adoption. The couple who took him in, Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, reversed his given names and tried to provide him with a stable home. But beneath the surface of this seemingly normal family, cracks were already forming that would eventually split wide open, releasing something monstrous into the world. The first real tragedy struck when Berkowitz was just 14 years old. His adoptive mother, Pearl, the one stable force in his life, died suddenly. The loss devastated him, but more than that, it severed the last thread connecting him to normal human emotion. His relationship with his adoptive father, Nathan, became strained and distant. The boy, who had once shown promise in school, began exhibiting disturbing behaviors. He started small fires, stole from neighbors, and displayed an unsettling fascination with violence that his teachers and family members tried desperately to ignore. S. Army, serving from 1971 to 1974. The military provided structure, discipline, and purpose. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might find his way back to normalcy. He served both in the United States and South Korea, earning an honorable discharge. But the demons that had been quietly growing inside him weren't so easily contained by military routine. When he returned to civilian life, the structure that had kept him grounded disappeared, and he found himself adrift in a world that felt increasingly hostile and meaningless. The decision to track down his birth mother would prove to be the final push toward his dark destiny. When Berkowitz finally located Betty Falco in the mid-1970s, he discovered truths that shattered what remained of his psychological stability. Not only had he been born out of wedlock, a fact that filled him with shame and rage, but his biological father had recently died. The rejection he felt from his birth parents, combined with the loss of his adoptive mother, created a perfect storm of abandonment and fury that began to consume him from the inside. By 1975, Berkowitz's mental state had deteriorated dramatically. He would later be diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic, but at the time, he was simply a young man spiraling into madness with no one to notice or intervene. He began experiencing violent fantasies that grew more vivid and compelling with each passing day. The line between fantasy and reality started to blur, and soon those dark thoughts began demanding action. Christmas Eve, 1975, marked his first attempt at murder. Berkowitz later claimed he stabbed 2 women with a hunting knife that night, though only one victim, Michelle Foreman, was confirmed. She survived the attack, and because there were no witnesses and no clear motive, the incident didn't raise suspicions about a potential serial killer. But for Berkowitz, that first taste of violence was intoxicating. The power he felt in that moment, the control over life and death, awakened something primal and terrible within him. The knife, however, proved too intimate, too messy, too unpredictable. Berkowitz wanted something cleaner, more efficient, more certain. 44 caliber bulldog revolver, a weapon that would become his signature and eventually his undoing. The gun represented everything he craved, absolute power delivered with mechanical precision. With this weapon in his possession, he was no longer just fantasizing about control over life and death. He possessed it. July 29th, 1976 was the night David Berkowitz truly became the son of Sam. 18-year-old Donna Loria was sitting in a car with her friend Jody Valenti outside Donna's apartment building in the Bronx. They were just two young women enjoying a summer evening, completely unaware that death was walking toward them through the darkness. Berkowitz approached the car and, without warning, opened fire through the passenger window. Donna died instantly. Jody survived but was severely wounded, becoming the first survivor of what would become a year-long reign of terror. The randomness of the attack baffled police. There was no apparent motive, no connection between the shooter and the victims, no robbery attempt. It seemed like senseless violence, but Berkowitz knew better. For him, it was the beginning of something magnificent and terrible. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the exhilaration he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. But one killing wasn't enough. The hunger that had been growing inside him for years now demanded to be fed regularly. Over the next several months, Berkowitz stalked the streets of New York, hunting for victims who fit his preferred profile: young women with long, dark hair, often accompanied by boyfriends or sitting in parked cars. His attacks followed a pattern that would become terrifyingly familiar to law enforcement and the media. On October 23, 1976, he struck again. Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan were sitting in a parked car in Queens when Berkowitz fired several shots through the rear window. Both survived, but Denaro was left with permanent disabilities from his head wound. 44 caliber weapon caught the attention of investigators who began to suspect they were dealing with a serial shooter. The attacks continued with methodical precision. On November 27, 1976, Donna DeMasi and Joanne Lamino were walking home from a movie when Berkowitz approached them and opened fire. Both women survived, but Lamino was paralyzed from the waist down. On January 30th, 1977, Christine Freund and John Deal were sitting in a car when Berkowitz fired through the window, killing Christine instantly. John survived but was traumatized by witnessing his girlfriend's murder. With each attack, the media coverage intensified and public fear grew. The killer's preference for young couples in parked cars and women with long dark hair became widely known. Across the city, hundreds of women cut and dyed their hair, hoping to avoid fitting the killer's apparent type. Restaurants and nightclubs saw their business plummet as people chose to stay home rather than risk becoming the next victim. On March 8, 1977, Virginia Voskerikian, a 19-year-old student, was walking home from Columbia University when she encountered Berkowitz on the street. She raised her textbooks to shield herself as he fired, but the bullet passed through them and killed her instantly. This daylight attack on a busy street demonstrated that the killer was becoming bolder and more brazen, escalating the public's terror to new heights. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to his capture came in the form of bizarre letters sent to police and prominent journalist Jimmy Breslin. In these rambling, incoherent messages, the killer revealed his twisted psychology and introduced the world to the son of Sam. He claimed that his neighbor's dog, a black Labrador retriever named Sam, was possessed by a demon that commanded him to kill. The dog's owner, Sam Carr, became an unwitting part of the killer's mythology. The letters were filled with references to demons, blood, and an insatiable hunger for death. They revealed a mind completely detached from reality, consumed by delusions of supernatural control and demonic influence. But more than that, they showed that the killer was enjoying the attention, reveling in the fear he was creating across the city. The media coverage had become part of his motivation, feeding his need for recognition and power. On April 17, 1977, Berkowitz committed what would be his most devastating attack. Alexander Esau and Valentina Suriani were sitting in a parked car in the Bronx when he approached and fired multiple shots, killing both of them instantly. At the scene, he left one of his taunting letters, further cementing his identity as the son of Sam and escalating the psychological warfare he was waging against the city. The final attack came on July 31st, 1977, in Brooklyn. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante were on their first date, sitting in a parked car near the shore when Berkowitz opened fire. Stacy died from her wounds, and Robert was left partially blinded, but this attack would prove to be different from the others. Witnesses reported seeing a man acting suspiciously near the scene, and more importantly, police found a parking ticket on a car that had been illegally parked near the crime scene. The parking ticket led investigators to David Berkowitz's address in Yonkers. When they surveilled his car, they found a rifle and a note containing threats against his next intended victims. On August 10, 1977, exactly 1 year and 12 days after his first confirmed kill, David Berkowitz was arrested as he approached his car. The reign of terror that had paralyzed New York City was finally over. When confronted by police, Berkowitz didn't resist or deny his crimes. Instead, he smiled and said, "You got me." His casual demeanor and apparent satisfaction with his capture revealed the depth of his psychological disturbance. During interrogation, he confessed to all 6 murders and 7 attempted murders, providing details that only the killer could have known. Initially, Berkowitz maintained his story about the demonic dog, claiming that he was merely following orders from supernatural forces beyond his control. But as psychiatric evaluations continued, a different picture emerged. The dog and demon story was largely fabricated, a convenient delusion that allowed him to distance himself from responsibility for his actions. The real David Berkowitz was a deeply troubled man who felt rejected and abandoned by the world, particularly by women, and who had found a twisted sense of purpose in terrorizing innocent people. In court, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 counts of second-degree murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 365 years in prison, effectively 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would never again walk free. Now we turn to a case that shattered the illusion of safety within the walls of what should have been a sanctuary for the elderly and vulnerable. In 1987, the Alpine Manor nursing home in Walker, Michigan, became the hunting ground for 2 women whose twisted love affair would manifest in the most heinous way imaginable. Gwendolyn Graham was 24 years old when she began working as a nurse's aide at Alpine Manor. Tall, Blonde and outwardly charming, she seemed like the perfect caregiver. But beneath her professional exterior lurked something far more sinister. Graham had grown up in a troubled household in Tyler, Texas, marked by instability and dysfunction. Her childhood was punctuated by episodes of cruelty toward animals and a fascination with death that would later manifest in ways no one could have predicted. Catherine Wood was 31, shorter and darker than Graham, with a quiet intensity that masked her own psychological turmoil. She had been working at Alpine Manor for several years when Graham arrived, establishing herself as a reliable employee who rarely drew attention. Wood came from her own background of emotional neglect and had struggled with her sexuality in a conservative community that offered little acceptance or understanding. When Graham and Wood met in early 1987, the attraction was immediate and intense. Their relationship quickly evolved from professional colleagues to lovers, but this was no ordinary romance. Both women harbored dark fantasies that, when combined, would create a perfect storm of evil. They began spending their shifts together, working the same halls, caring for the same patients, and slowly, methodically, planning something unthinkable. The residents of Alpine Manor were among society's most vulnerable members. Many suffered from advanced Alzheimer's disease, unable to communicate or defend themselves. Others were bedridden, completely dependent on their caregivers for survival. These elderly women, ranging in age from 60 to 98, had families who trusted the facility to provide compassionate care during their final years. Instead, they became prey for two predators who saw their helplessness as an opportunity. Graham and Wood's initial plan was chillingly methodical. It was a twisted signature they wanted to leave behind, a secret code that would bind them together in their shared guilt. But reality proved more complicated than their fantasy. Their first intended victim fought back more than they expected, struggling against the washcloth pressed over her face, making them realize their game might be harder to execute than they had imagined. Abandoning their spelling scheme, Graham and Wood began selecting victims based purely on vulnerability. They targeted what they called total care patients because these residents could not struggle vigorously, and many lacked the ability to communicate what was happening to them. The women would patrol the halls during their shifts, identifying the weakest residents, those who would offer the least resistance to their horrific plans. Their method was suffocation, typically using a washcloth to cover their victim's nose and mouth while the other acted as a lookout. They would take turns performing the actual murder, each wanting to share equally in the act that they believed strengthened their bond. In their twisted minds, having something to hold over each other, sharing the ultimate secret, was a form of intimacy that transcended normal romantic connection. The casual nature of their crimes was perhaps most disturbing of all. During their shifts, they would joke about their victims, referring to them by cruel nicknames and discussing their murders as if they were ordinary workplace gossip. They even began taking personal belongings from their victims as macabre souvenirs, small items that families would later discover missing, never knowing these trinkets had become trophies for killers. What made their crimes even more shocking was how they openly discussed their actions with colleagues. Graham would boast about the murders to other staff members, describing in detail how they selected and killed their victims. Wood would laugh along, adding her own disturbing comments about the ease with which they could end lives. But their co-workers dismissed these confessions as sick humor, dark jokes that healthcare workers sometimes use to cope with the constant presence of death. No one believed that two seemingly normal women could actually be murdering the patients they were paid to protect. The residents they killed included Marguerite Chambers, 67, who had been at Alpine Manor for only a few months when Graham and Wood decided she would be their first official victim. Edith Cook, 98, was so frail she could barely lift her head, making her an easy target for their suffocation method. Mae Mason, 79, had been recovering from a stroke and was beginning to show signs of improvement when her life was cut short. Myrtle Luce, 95, and Belle Burkhard, 74, were both beloved by their families and had been looking forward to visits from grandchildren they would never see again. Each murder was committed during the night shift, when staffing was minimal and supervision was lax. Graham and Wood would wait until the hallways were empty, then slip into their chosen victim's room. While one held the washcloth over the resident's face, the other would watch the door, ensuring no one would interrupt their horrific work. They reported that they would sometimes test potential victims by pinching their nostrils closed to see how violently they would struggle, using this as a gauge for how easy the actual murder would be. The deaths were initially attributed to natural causes, which was not uncommon in a nursing home setting where elderly residents frequently passed away. The facility's medical staff saw nothing suspicious about the timing or circumstances of these deaths. Death certificates were signed, bodies were cremated or buried, and families grieved what they believed were natural passings of their loved ones. But Graham and Wood's relationship was as volatile as it was twisted. Their arguments were frequent and intense, often centering around jealousy and control. Wood began to resent Graham's increasingly reckless behavior and her casual attitude toward their crimes. Graham, meanwhile, grew bored with their routine and began talking about expanding their killing spree, possibly targeting other nursing homes or even moving beyond elderly victims. In late 1988, their relationship finally collapsed when Graham announced she was moving to Texas to start a new life. Wood was devastated, not just by the loss of her lover, but by the realization that Graham might continue killing elsewhere. The thought of Graham targeting new victims, perhaps developing new methods or finding new partners in crime, haunted Wood's conscience. It was then that Wood made a decision that would finally bring justice for their victims. She confessed everything to her ex-husband, describing in detail how she and Graham had systematically murdered helpless elderly women. Her ex-husband, horrified by what he heard, immediately contacted the police, setting in motion an investigation that would expose one of the most shocking cases of healthcare serial killing in American history. The investigation was complex and challenging. Most of the victims had been cremated, making forensic evidence nearly impossible to obtain. However, 2 bodies had been buried rather than cremated, allowing for exhumation and examination. While direct physical evidence was scarce in smothering cases, Wood's detailed confessions provided investigators with enough information to build a case. Wood's cooperation with authorities was extensive and damning. She provided specific details about each murder, including the dates, times, methods, and locations. She described how they selected victims, how they avoided detection, and how they disposed of evidence. Her testimony painted a picture of two women who had turned their workplace into a hunting ground, betraying the trust of families and the most basic principles of healthcare. The investigation revealed that Graham and Wood had considered killing as many as 20 residents, actively planning an extended murder spree that would have made them among the most prolific healthcare serial killers in history. They had discussed methods, potential victims, and ways to avoid suspicion, treating murder as a hobby they could pursue together during their working hours. In December 1988, both women were arrested. Wood was taken into custody in Michigan, while Graham was apprehended in Texas, where she had been working at another healthcare facility. The arrests sent shockwaves through the nursing home industry and raised serious questions about background checks, supervision, and the protection of vulnerable residents. During the legal proceedings, Wood accepted a plea bargain, agreeing to testify against Graham in exchange for a reduced sentence. She portrayed Graham as the mastermind and primary killer, claiming she had been manipulated and coerced into participating in the murders. Wood's testimony was crucial to the prosecution's case, providing insider details that only someone directly involved in the crimes could have known. Gwendolyn Graham was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder. In November 1989, she was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. During her trial, she showed little remorse for her actions, maintaining that she had been acting out of love for Wood and that their crimes had been a form of bonding that others couldn't understand. Catherine Wood pleaded guilty to 1 count of second-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit second-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, becoming eligible for parole in 2005. Wood's cooperation with authorities and her apparent remorse contributed to her lighter sentence, though families of the victims questioned whether anyone involved in such heinous crimes deserved the possibility of freedom. The case of the lethal lovers exposed serious flaws in the nursing home system and led to increased scrutiny of healthcare workers who have access to vulnerable populations. It highlighted the need for better background checks, improved supervision, and more robust reporting mechanisms for suspicious deaths in care facilities. Catherine Wood was eventually released from prison in January 2020, having served nearly 30 years for her role in the murders. Her release was met with mixed reactions from victims' families, some of whom felt that no amount of time could adequately punish someone who had betrayed such fundamental trust. The Alpine Manor case remains one of the most disturbing examples of healthcare serial killing, demonstrating how 2 individuals can feed off each other's darkness to commit acts that neither might have attempted alone. Patrick Wayne Kearney appeared to be the perfect neighbor, quiet, polite, well-dressed, and holding down a steady job as an engineer at Hughes Aircraft. He lived in a modest home in Redondo Beach, California, with his longtime partner, David Hill, blending seamlessly into suburban life throughout the 1960s and 70s. Born in 1939 in East Texas, Patrick's childhood was marked by isolation and cruelty from his peers. He was small, sickly, and spoke with a high-pitched voice that made him an easy target for bullies. His parents were emotionally distant, offering little comfort or protection from the relentless torment he faced at school. Rather than fight back, Patrick retreated inward, constructing elaborate fantasy worlds where he held all the power. At first, these daydreams were simple revenge scenarios against his tormentors, but as years passed, the fantasies grew darker and more violent. By his early teens, Patrick wasn't just imagining his bullies being humiliated or hurt. He was picturing them dead, their bodies still and silent. These weren't fleeting thoughts, but detailed mental movies he would replay obsessively, finding comfort and eventually arousal in visions of death and absolute control. After completing his military service in the Air Force, Patrick moved to California and met David Hill. Their relationship provided the perfect cover for Patrick's growing homicidal urges. To the outside world, they were just another quiet couple living an ordinary life. David was handsome and charismatic, where Patrick was awkward and withdrawn. Their partnership allowed Patrick to blend into society while harboring his increasingly violent fantasies. In 1962, Patrick crossed the line from fantasy to reality. He picked up a teenage hitchhiker along a California highway, a boy who was simply looking for a ride to his destination. Patrick seemed harmless enough, making small talk as they drove through the countryside. But somewhere along that lonely stretch of road, with no warning or provocation, Patrick pulled out a small .22 caliber pistol and shot the boy in the head. The killing was swift, clinical, and utterly without emotion. Patrick felt no remorse, no shock, no horror at what he had done. Instead, he experienced a rush of power unlike anything he had ever felt. He drove for miles with the corpse beside him, calm and focused, before pulling off into a remote canyon. There, he sexually violated the body and dismembered it with methodical precision, burying some parts and leaving others for scavengers to dispose of. That first murder didn't disturb Patrick. It liberated him. He had discovered the ultimate expression of control, the final answer to years of powerlessness and humiliation. From that moment forward, killing became not just a compulsion, but a carefully refined skill. Over the next 15 years, Patrick developed his method with terrifying efficiency. He would cruise California's highways during dawn or dusk hours, searching for vulnerable targets. Young men, teenage boys, hitchhikers, runaways, people who wouldn't be missed quickly or at all. His victims ranged from 5-year-old Ronald Dean Smith, lured from his front yard while playing with a toy truck, to 28-year-old adults seeking rides along busy freeways. Patrick's approach was deceptively simple. He would pull up beside potential victims, offer them a ride with a friendly smile, and wait for them to get in. Once they were trapped in his vehicle, he would shoot them in the head with his .22 caliber pistol. The small caliber bullet was quiet and efficient, killing instantly while leaving minimal blood spatter in his car. But the murder was only the beginning of Patrick's ritual. After killing his victims, he would drive to secluded locations where he could sexually assault the corpses without interruption. These acts of necrophilia were central to his pathology, fulfilling twisted desires that had been building since his tormented childhood. The dead couldn't resist, couldn't mock him, couldn't make him feel powerless or inadequate. Following his sexual violations, Patrick would transport the bodies to his home, where he would dismember them in his bathtub using a hacksaw. He approached this grisly task with the same methodical precision he brought to his engineering work, carefully separating limbs from torsos and wrapping each piece in heavy-duty plastic trash bags. These bags would then be sealed tightly and transported to remote locations throughout Southern California. Patrick's disposal sites were chosen with strategic calculation. He favored desolate stretches of the Mojave Desert, isolated canyons as in the Angeles National Forest, and secluded areas along major freeways. The scattered locations made it difficult for law enforcement to connect the discoveries and recognize the work of a single killer. Some remains were found quickly by hikers or maintenance workers, while others lay hidden for months or years before being discovered. The efficiency of Patrick's operation was chilling. He could abduct, murder, violate, dismember, and dispose of a victim within 24 hours, then return to work the next day as if nothing had happened. His colleagues at Hughes Aircraft described him as reliable, quiet, and unremarkable. He never missed deadlines, never caused trouble, never gave anyone reason to suspect the horror he was orchestrating in his spare time. Patrick's relationship with David Hill served as both camouflage and catalyst for his crimes. When the couple argued or experienced relationship stress, Patrick would often disappear for long drives, returning hours later in a better mood. Hill later claimed he had no knowledge of the murders, though investigators have always questioned whether he could have remained completely unaware of the strange odors, odd hours, and suspicious activities occurring in their shared home. Among Patrick's youngest victims was 5-year-old Ronald Dean Smith, who was playing outside his home in Lenox, California, when Patrick spotted him. The little boy was lured into the car with kind words and promises, then smothered rather than shot due to his size. His tiny body was found dumped along a remote roadside, the sight of his decomposed remains haunting investigators for decades. 8-year-old Merle Chance was walking home from a corner store when Patrick offered him a ride. The trusting child climbed into the car, only to be smothered and dumped deep in the forest. Patrick had chosen the disposal site carefully, ensuring the body would be hidden from casual discovery, while animals and elements would eventually destroy evidence. The case began to unravel in 1977 when 17-year-old John LeMay mentioned to a neighbor that he was going to visit someone named Dave. When John disappeared and his dismembered remains were found in the Mojave Desert, police followed the lead to Patrick's house. The timeline didn't match Patrick's alibi, and inconsistencies in his story raised immediate suspicions. Faced with mounting evidence, Patrick and David fled California, becoming fugitives who ironically lived like the transients Patrick had once preyed upon. They hitchhiked across state lines, slept in cheap motels, and survived on minimal resources while law enforcement agencies coordinated a nationwide manhunt. The pressure became unbearable, and they eventually walked into a Texas police station to surrender. During his interrogation, Patrick displayed the same clinical detachment that had characterized his crimes. He methodically listed 28 names, describing in precise detail how he had selected, killed, and disposed of each victim. He showed no emotion, no remorse, no recognition of the human cost of his actions. To Patrick, his victims had been objects to be used and discarded, no different from the electronic components he assembled at work. Some of the victims Patrick described had never been reported missing. Runaways, drifters, young men estranged from their families, people who had fallen through society's cracks and whose disappearances went unnoticed. Others had been the subjects of intensive searches and heartbroken family appeals, but the connection to Patrick had never been established. The geographic scope of Patrick's crimes was staggering. He had dumped remains across multiple counties, from the beaches of Southern California to the remote desert regions hundreds of miles inland. Some disposal sites were discovered only after his confessions provided specific directions, while others remain lost to this day. To avoid the death penalty, Patrick accepted a plea bargain and was sentenced to 21 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He was convicted of 21 murders, though he had confessed to 28, and investigators suspected the true number might be even higher. The discrepancy reflected both the difficulty of recovering evidence from his scattered disposal sites and the challenges of identifying victims who had been missing for years. Patrick later attempted to recant his confessions, claiming he had been coerced and that his detailed knowledge of the crimes came from police files rather than personal involvement. However, his descriptions included information that only the killer could have known, specific details about the victims' final moments and the remote locations where their remains had been hidden. Today, Patrick Kearney sits in Mule Creek State Prison in California, now in his 80s and largely forgotten by a public that never knew his name, as well as more famous serial killers. He rarely grants interviews, writes no letters to the media, and has shown no interest in the attention that some killers crave. He exists in quiet anonymity, a ghost from an era when California's freeways were hunting grounds for predators. The true scope of Patrick's crimes may never be fully known. His 15-year killing spree coincided with a period of high mobility in American society when young people routinely hitchhiked across the country and missing persons cases often went cold due to limited communication between law enforcement agencies. How many other victims lie buried in unmarked graves throughout the Southwest? How many families never learned what happened to their missing sons and brothers? The case of Patrick Kearney demonstrates how a methodical, intelligent killer can operate undetected for years when targeting society's most vulnerable members. His victims were chosen not for personal reasons, but for their availability and disposability. They were young men whose disappearances wouldn't immediately trigger massive investigations, people whose absence might be attributed to the wandering lifestyle of youth rather than predatory violence. The investigation into Patrick's crimes revolutionized how law enforcement agencies share information across jurisdictional boundaries. The scattered nature of his disposal sites had initially prevented investigators from recognizing patterns that might have led to his earlier capture. His case became a template for understanding how serial killers exploit geographic and bureaucratic boundaries to avoid detection. For the families of Patrick's victims, his capture and confession provided answers to years of agonizing uncertainty. Parents who had wondered if their missing children might still be alive somewhere finally learned the truth, as devastating as it was. The recovery of remains allowed for proper burials and the beginning of a grief process that had been suspended in hope and denial. Patrick Kearney's story is a reminder that evil often hides behind the most ordinary facades. The quiet neighbor, the reliable employee, the unremarkable man who blends seamlessly into suburban life might harbor unimaginable darkness. His 15-year reign of terror across California's highways claimed at least 28 lives and possibly many more, making him one of America's most prolific yet least known serial killers. The trash bags that gave him his nickname have long since biodegraded in landfills and remote canyons, but the horror they contained continues to echo through the families and communities forever changed by his crimes. The Rainbow Maniac represents one of Brazil's most terrifying chapters in criminal history, though the truth behind this moniker reveals a disturbing pattern of violence that shattered the lives of countless victims across Sao Paulo. The name itself has become synonymous with two separate but equally horrifying crime sprees that terrorized Brazil in the late 1990s and early 2000s, creating a climate of fear that gripped the nation. The first killer associated with this name was Francisco de Assis Pereira, a man whose ordinary appearance masked an extraordinary capacity for evil. Born on November 29, 1967, in Sao Paulo, Francisco grew up in a world that seemed to twist his understanding of human connection into something predatory and violent. His childhood was marked by trauma that would later manifest in ways no one could have predicted. Reports suggest he suffered sexual abuse as a child, experiences that warped his developing psyche and laid the groundwork for the monster he would become. By his 20s, Francisco had found work as a motorcycle courier in Sao Paulo, a job that gave him intimate knowledge of the city's layout and the perfect cover for his hunting grounds. He could move through the sprawling metropolis virtually unnoticed, just another delivery driver navigating the chaotic streets. But Francisco wasn't delivering packages. He was stalking prey. His method was as calculated as it was cruel. Francisco would approach young women with a story that played on their dreams and aspirations. He claimed to be a talent scout for a modeling agency, offering them opportunities that seemed too good to be true. In a country where beauty pageants and modeling represented paths to success and recognition, his offer was intoxicating. These women, many of them teenagers or young adults from working-class families, saw a chance to escape their circumstances and build better lives. The modeling agency story was perfect bait. Francisco would approach his victims in public places, always friendly and professional. He carried fake business cards and spoke convincingly about photo shoots and opportunities. He understood human psychology well enough to know that hope could override caution, especially when presented by someone who appeared legitimate and successful. Once he gained their trust, Francisco would suggest they visit a location for an impromptu photo session or casting call. He often lured them to Parque do Estado, a sprawling park in Sao Paulo that offered plenty of isolated areas where screams would go unheard. The park, meant to be a place of recreation and natural beauty, became his personal hunting ground. What happened next was a nightmare that no victim survived to describe. Francisco would sexually assault his victims with savage brutality, often leaving distinctive bite marks on their bodies, particularly on shoulders, breasts, and legs. These weren't crimes of passion or opportunity. They were methodical, ritualistic acts of violence that fed something dark and insatiable within him. After the sexual assault, Francisco would strangle his victims, often using shoelaces as his weapon of choice. The ligature marks on their necks told a story of prolonged suffering, of victims who fought desperately for their lives as Francisco tightened his grip. He didn't kill quickly. He savored the process, drawing out their final moments as he watched the life drain from their eyes. The bodies began appearing in Parque do Estado in 1998, discovered by horrified park visitors and maintenance workers. Each victim was found naked, bearing the brutal evidence of rape and beating. The bite marks became Francisco's signature, a calling card that linked the crimes and confirmed police fears that a serial killer was operating in their city. The first confirmed victim was 19-year-old Elisangela Antonio, found dead in the park on April 12, 1998. Her body showed signs of severe trauma, and the bite marks were so pronounced that investigators knew immediately they were dealing with someone capable of extraordinary violence. More bodies followed in rapid succession, each one telling the same horrifying story of deception, assault, and murder. As the body count rose, panic spread through Sao Paulo like wildfire. Young women who had once moved freely through the city began looking over their shoulders, suspicious of every stranger who approached them. Parents kept their daughters close, and the modeling industry itself came under scrutiny as agencies tried to distance themselves from the killer's ruse. The media coverage was intense and often sensationalized, with newspapers competing to provide the most graphic details of the crimes. The killer was dubbed various names, but Rainbow Maniac stuck, though the origin of this particular moniker remains somewhat unclear. Some reports suggest it was related to the diverse backgrounds of his victims, while others claim it referenced the colorful clothing some victims were wearing when they disappeared. Francisco's killing spree intensified throughout 1998, with bodies discovered at an alarming rate. Each crime scene revealed new horrors, new evidence of his escalating violence. He seemed to be growing bolder, more confident in his ability to evade capture. The police were under enormous pressure to solve the case, but Francisco had been careful to leave little physical evidence beyond the bodies themselves. The investigation was complicated by the sheer size of Sao Paulo and the transient nature of Francisco's work as a courier. He could strike anywhere in the city and disappear into the urban maze before anyone realized what had happened. His motorcycle allowed him to move quickly through traffic and escape down narrow alleys where police cars couldn't follow. But Francisco's arrogance would ultimately be his downfall. As his confidence grew, he became less careful about being seen with his victims. Witnesses began to come forward with descriptions of a man on a motorcycle who had been seen talking to some of the victims shortly before they disappeared. The police were able to piece together a composite sketch, though it was generic enough that it could have described thousands of men in Sao Paulo. The breakthrough came when Francisco attempted to lure another victim, but was interrupted by her friends, who became suspicious of his modeling agency story. They confronted him, and Francisco fled on his motorcycle, but not before one of them managed to get a partial license plate number. The police traced the registration and finally had their first solid lead. On August 4th, 1998, Francisco de Assis Pereira was arrested in Itaqui, Rio Grande do Sul, after a 23-day manhunt that captivated the entire nation. He had fled Sao Paulo when he realized the police were closing in, but his face had been plastered across every newspaper and television screen in Brazil. A fisherman who had been giving him shelter recognized him from the media coverage and contacted authorities. When police arrived to arrest him, Francisco didn't resist. In fact, he seemed almost relieved that his reign of terror was finally over. During interrogation, he confessed to killing 11 women and assaulting 9 others, though investigators suspected the true number of victims might be higher. Some cases remained unsolved, and Francisco's travels as a courier meant he could have committed crimes in other cities without being detected. Francisco's confessions were chilling in their matter-of-fact tone. He described his crimes with an emotional detachment that horrified investigators. He spoke about his victims as if they were objects rather than human beings, showing no remorse for the lives he had destroyed or the families he had shattered. He claimed to be possessed by an evil force, saying he was unable to resist his dark side. During his trial, psychiatrists diagnosed Francisco with antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. He showed all the classic signs of a serial killer: lack of empathy, superficial charm, and an inability to form genuine human connections. The abuse he suffered as a child may have been a contributing factor, but it didn't excuse the choices he made or the lives he took. Francisco de Assis Pereira was sentenced to 268 years in prison, ensuring he would never again walk free. His case became one of the most infamous in Brazilian criminal history, with a 2004 survey showing that 76% of Brazilians could identify him by name and photograph. The intense media coverage had made him a household name, though not in the way he might have hoped when he first began his killing spree. But the story of the Rainbow Maniac doesn't end with Francisco's imprisonment. The name would resurface years later in connection with another serial killer who terrorized São Paulo's gay community. This second Rainbow Maniac targeted men in Pitoris Park, creating confusion about which killer the moniker truly belonged to. The overlap in names has led to ongoing confusion in media reports and true crime discussions, with some sources conflating the two separate crime sprees. The legacy of Francisco de Assis Pereira's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims and their families. His case exposed vulnerabilities in Brazilian society, particularly the way predators could exploit young women's dreams of escaping poverty through modeling and entertainment. It also highlighted the challenges law enforcement faced in tracking serial killers in a sprawling urban environment like São Paulo. The modeling industry in Brazil was forced to implement new safety protocols and verification procedures to prevent similar deceptions. Young women became more cautious about unsolicited offers, and families became more protective of their daughters. The sense of innocence and trust that had allowed Francisco to operate so effectively was forever damaged. For the families of his victims, the pain never truly ends. These were young women with their whole lives ahead of them, dreams and aspirations that were brutally cut short by a man who saw them as nothing more than objects for his twisted gratification. Their deaths sent shockwaves through their communities and left scars that still haven't healed. The Rainbow Maniac case also became a watershed moment for Brazilian law enforcement, leading to improvements in interagency cooperation and the development of better protocols for tracking serial offenders. The investigation revealed gaps in communication between different police departments and highlighted the need for a more coordinated approach to major crimes. Francisco de Assis Pereira remains imprisoned today, a forgotten man whose name is synonymous with one of Brazil's darkest chapters. His crimes serve as a reminder of the capacity for evil that can lurk behind the most ordinary facades and the importance of remaining vigilant in a world where predators walk among us, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. The women he killed were more than just statistics or case files. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and dreamers whose lives were stolen by a man who chose to feed his darkest impulses rather than seek help for his demons. Their memory deserves to be honored, and their stories deserve to be told, not just as victims of the rainbow maniac, but as the individuals who mattered, who were loved, and who are still missed by those who knew them. Our final case brings us to Richard Mark Evonitz, a predator who managed to hide his monstrous nature behind the facade of military service and suburban normalcy. Unlike many serial killers who display obvious warning signs, Evonitz was a master of deception, maintaining relationships and employment while secretly planning and executing some of the most heinous crimes imaginable. Richard Mark Evonitz was born on July 29th in 1963 in Columbia, South Carolina, into what appeared to be a typical American family. His early years showed no obvious signs of the monster he would become. He was an average student, participated in normal childhood activities, and seemed to blend seamlessly into his community. This ordinary beginning would later make his crimes all the more shocking to those who thought they knew him. As a young man, Evonitz chose to serve his country, enlisting in the United States Navy, where he trained as a sonar technician. Military service often provides structure and purpose for young people, and Evonitz appeared to thrive in this environment. He served honorably for 8 years, earning the respect of his fellow sailors and superiors. His military records showed no disciplinary issues, no red flags that might have predicted his future actions. However, even during his military service, cracks in Evonitz's facade were beginning to show. In 1987, while stationed in Florida, he was convicted of lewd exposure, a seemingly minor offense that would later be recognized as an early warning sign of his escalating sexual deviance. This incident was dismissed by many as a youthful indiscretion, the kind of mistake that young servicemen sometimes make. No one could have predicted it was actually the first glimpse of a much darker pattern. After his honorable discharge from the Navy, Evonitz returned to civilian life and settled in Spotsylvania County, Virginia, a quiet suburban area that seemed perfect for someone looking to start fresh. He found work in various blue-collar jobs, presenting himself as a reliable, hard-working man who had served his country with distinction. He was the kind of neighbor people trusted, the kind of employee who showed up on time and did his job without complaint. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Evonitz was nurturing fantasies that would eventually consume him. He became obsessed with teenage girls, spending hours planning elaborate abduction scenarios and developing techniques for avoiding detection. His military training had taught him discipline and attention to detail, skills he now perverted for the most evil purposes imaginable. Evonitz's first confirmed victim was 16-year-old Sophia Silva, a bright and beautiful teenager who had her whole life ahead of her. On September 9th, 1996, Sophia had just returned home from school to her family's house near Loriella Park in Spotsylvania County. It was a routine day, the kind of ordinary afternoon that millions of teenagers experience without incident. But for Sophia, it would be her last. Evonitz had been watching Sophia, studying her routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity. When she arrived home that day, he was ready. The exact details of her abduction remain unclear, but investigators believe Evonitz approached her under some pretense, possibly claiming to need directions or assistance. His military bearing and clean-cut appearance would have made him seem trustworthy, certainly not the kind of person parents warned their children about. Once he had Sophia in his control, Evonitz transported her to a location where he could carry out his twisted fantasies without interruption. For Sophia, the next hours or days must have been an unimaginable nightmare. She was subjected to sexual assault and torture before Evonitz finally ended her suffering by taking her life. Sophia's body was discovered a month later in a creek in King George County, wrapped in a white cover that Evonitz had used to conceal his crime. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community and launched a massive investigation. But perhaps the most disturbing detail was that Sophia's pubic hair had been shaved off, a signature that would later link her murder to subsequent crimes. The investigation into Sophia's murder consumed countless hours and resources, but Evonitz had been careful to leave little evidence behind. He had learned from his military training how to plan operations and avoid detection, skills that served him well in his new role as a predator. The case gradually went cold, leaving Sophia's family with questions that might never be answered and a pain that would never fully heal. For several months, it seemed like Sophia's murder might have been an isolated incident, a horrific crime committed by someone who had since moved on or stopped killing. But Evonitz was far from finished. His successful abduction and murder of Sophia had only fueled his appetite for violence, and he began planning his next attack with the same methodical precision he had brought to his naval duties. On May 1st, 1997, Evonitz struck again, but this time his evil reached new depths. Sisters Kristen Lisk, 15, and Cotty Lisk, 12, were playing in the front yard of their Spotsylvania County home when Evonitz approached them. The two girls, like Sophia before them, had no reason to suspect that the clean-cut man who approached them posed any danger. Using tactics similar to those he had employed with Sophia, Evonitz managed to gain control of both sisters and transport them to his killing ground. For the Lisk family, what began as a normal day quickly became every parent's worst nightmare. The girls simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the terrible certainty that something awful had happened. Evonitz held the sisters captive for days, subjecting them to sexual assault and torture that defies description. The younger sister, Kati, was only 12 years old, an innocent child who had never experienced anything more traumatic than a scraped knee or a bad grade. The horror she must have endured at Evonitz's hands is almost impossible to comprehend. Kristen, at 15, was old enough to understand more fully what was happening to her and her little sister. She likely tried to protect Kati, to shield her from the worst of Evonitz's violence. The bond between the sisters, which had been a source of joy and companionship throughout their lives, became a weapon that Evonitz could use to torture them both. 5 days after their abduction, the bodies of Kristen and Kati Lisk were discovered in the South Anna River, approximately 40 miles from their home. Like Sophia Silva before them, both girls had their pubic areas shaved, establishing a clear link between the crimes. The discovery of their bodies confirmed the community's worst fears and launched another massive investigation. The murders of the Lisk sisters marked a significant escalation in Evonitz's crimes. Not only had he taken two victims instead of one, but he had also kept them alive for an extended period, suggesting that his fantasies were becoming more elaborate and his need for control more pronounced. The fact that he had successfully abducted and murdered three victims without being caught only increased his confidence and his sense of invincibility. For the next 5 years, Evonitz managed to avoid detection while the cases of Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters remained unsolved. He continued to live in the Spotsylvania area until 1999, maintaining his facade of normalcy while secretly reliving his crimes and possibly planning new ones. The families of his victims lived with the constant pain of not knowing who had taken their daughters and why. In 1999, Evonitz moved to South Carolina, possibly sensing that the heat was getting too intense in Virginia or simply wanting a change of scenery. He settled into another blue-collar job and continued to present himself as a model citizen and military veteran. But the move to South Carolina didn't represent a change in his nature, only a change in his hunting grounds. On June 24th, 2002, Evonitz's carefully constructed world began to unravel when he made the mistake of targeting 15-year-old Kara Robinson in Lexington, South Carolina. Kara was at a friend's house when Evonitz approached her, claiming to be distributing pamphlets for a charity or community organization. His story seemed plausible enough, and his clean-cut appearance suggested he was legitimate. But when Kara moved closer to accept the pamphlets, Evonitz suddenly pulled out a gun and forced her into a large plastic container in the back of his vehicle. The abduction happened so quickly that Kara's friend, who was inside the house, didn't realize anything was wrong until Kara simply failed to come back inside. Evonitz transported Kara to his apartment, beginning what he undoubtedly planned to be another extended torture session ending in murder. But Kara Robinson was different from his previous victims. Despite being terrified and traumatized, she maintained her composure and began gathering information that might help her survive, or if she didn't survive, help police catch her killer. During the 18 hours of captivity that followed, Kara endured sexual assault and torture while carefully observing every detail of her surroundings. She noted the layout of the apartment, the sounds from neighboring units, distinctive features that might help police identify the location. She even managed to steal a few small items that could serve as evidence if she somehow managed to escape. Most importantly, Kara studied her captor, memorizing his appearance, his mannerisms, his voice, and anything else that might help police identify him. She realized that her survival might depend on her ability to provide law enforcement with detailed information, and she was determined to be the best possible witness to her own ordeal. Evonitz, confident in his ability to control the situation, eventually grew tired and fell asleep. This was the moment Kara had been waiting for. Despite being restrained, she managed to work herself free and escape from the apartment. Her flight to freedom was a desperate race against time, knowing that Evonitz could wake up at any moment and discover her absence. Kara's escape was nothing short of miraculous. She managed to reach safety and immediately contacted police, providing them with the detailed information she had so carefully gathered during her captivity. Her descriptions of the apartment, the captor, and the circumstances of her abduction gave investigators their first real break in what had become a series of cold cases. The information Kara provided allowed police to identify Evonitz and connect him to the unsolved murders in Virginia. When they searched his apartment, they found a disturbing collection of evidence that confirmed their worst suspicions. Newspaper clippings about the Silva and Lisk murders, personal belongings taken from the victims, and handwritten notes detailing his crimes painted a picture of a man who had been reliving his murders for years. But Evonitz wasn't going to surrender quietly. When police attempted to arrest him, he fled in his vehicle, leading them on a high-speed chase through the streets of Sarasota, Florida. The chase ended when police deployed spike strips that disabled his vehicle, but even then, Evonitz wasn't finished fighting. Faced with the certainty of capture and the overwhelming evidence against him, Richard Mark Evonitz made his final choice: .25 caliber handgun, and shot himself in the head. His suicide robbed the families of his victims of the chance to see him face justice in a courtroom, but it also prevented him from claiming any more victims. The investigation that followed Evonitz's death revealed the full scope of his crimes and confirmed the worst fears of investigators. DNA evidence definitively linked him to the murders of Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters, finally providing closure to families who had waited years for answers. The evidence found in his apartment, including Kristen Lisk's fingerprints in his car, left no doubt about his guilt. This admission suggested that his known victims might represent only a fraction of his actual crimes, and that there could be other families out there still wondering what happened to their missing daughters. The case of Richard Mark Evonitz serves as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. His military service, his steady employment, his ability to maintain relationships and present himself as a model citizen all served as camouflage for his true nature. The families of his victims, the communities where he lived, and the fellow veterans who served alongside him were all deceived by his carefully constructed persona. But the case also demonstrates the incredible courage and intelligence of survivors like Kara Robinson, whose quick thinking and determination not only saved her own life, but also brought a serial killer to justice. Her ability to gather crucial evidence while enduring unimaginable trauma helped solve multiple murders and prevented Evonitz from claiming additional victims. The crimes of Richard Mark Evonitz, like those of all the killers we've examined, remind us that the capacity for evil exists in the most unexpected places, hidden behind smiles and uniforms and the ordinary routines of suburban life. The morning of June 24th, 2002, started like any other summer day for 15-year-old Kara Robinson. She was watering plants in her friend's front yard in Columbia, South Carolina, when a man approached carrying what looked like magazines or pamphlets. He seemed friendly enough, just another neighbor or salesman making his rounds through the quiet suburban neighborhood. But when Kara turned to face him, she found herself staring down the barrel of a gun. What happened next would expose one of the most calculating and methodical predators to ever walk free in America. A man who had been hiding in plain sight for years, systematically hunting teenage girls while maintaining the perfect facade of normalcy. His name was Richard Mark Evonitz, and by the time authorities finally caught up to him, 3 families would be destroyed, and an entire community would learn that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Richard Evonitz was born on July 29, 1963, in Columbia, South Carolina. By all accounts, He had what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary childhood. His family was stable, his parents were hardworking, and nothing in his early years suggested the monster he would become. He was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of kid who blended into the background and was easily forgotten. But that ability to remain invisible, to be overlooked and underestimated, would later become his greatest weapon. After high school, Evonitz enlisted in the United States Navy, where he served honorably for 8 years as a sonar technician. His military record was clean, his performance satisfactory, and his discharge papers showed no red flags whatsoever. To his fellow servicemen, he was just another sailor doing his job and keeping his head down. But even then, there were signs that something wasn't right beneath the surface. In 1987, while stationed in Florida, Evonitz was convicted of lewd exposure. The details were minimal, the punishment light, and the incident was quickly forgotten by everyone except the man himself. But this wasn't just a moment of poor judgment or youthful indiscretion. It was the first documented evidence of a sexual deviance that was growing stronger and more dangerous with each passing year. After leaving the Navy, Evonitz bounced between various blue-collar jobs, working as a traveling salesman and moving frequently across the country. He was married, held steady employment, and to anyone who met him, he seemed like a perfectly normal working-class American. He was polite, soft-spoken, and had an almost forgettable presence that made him easy to trust and impossible to suspect. But Richard Evonitz was conducting a different kind of business during his travels. He was studying, learning, perfecting his craft. He would drive through suburban neighborhoods, taking note of houses where teenage girls lived. He observed their routines, their schedules, their vulnerabilities. He identified homes where parents worked late, where girls walked alone, where opportunities presented themselves. And he was patient, methodically building a mental database of potential victims while maintaining his mask of respectability. See, it was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where teenagers walked alone without fear, where parents trusted their neighborhoods and their neighbors. For Richard Evonitz, it was the perfect hunting ground. For 3 years, he continued his surveillance, driving through neighborhoods and cataloging targets. He had developed specific preferences: girls between the ages of 12 and 16, preferably with long hair, usually alone or vulnerable. He studied their patterns obsessively, learning when they came home from school, when their parents were at work, when opportunities would arise. And then, on September 9th, 1996, he finally acted. 16-year-old Sophia Silva had just returned home from school to her house near Loriella Park. She was a bright, popular student with her whole life ahead of her. Her parents were still at work, and she was alone when Richard Evonitz approached her front door. Exactly what he said to gain entry into her house remains unknown, but within minutes, Sophia Silva had vanished without a trace. For weeks, the community searched desperately for any sign of the missing teenager. Volunteers combed through woods and fields, police followed every lead, and Sophia's family held on to hope that she would be found alive. But on October 1st, nearly a month after her disappearance, Sophia's decomposed body was discovered in a creek in neighboring King George County. She had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and in a detail that would later prove crucial to connecting other crimes, Her pubic hair had been completely shaved off. The discovery of Sophia's body sent shockwaves through Spotsylvania County. Parents suddenly realized that their quiet suburban community wasn't as safe as they had believed. But even as police launched a massive investigation, Richard Evonitz remained completely off their radar. He had been careful, methodical, and had left behind virtually no evidence that could be traced back to him. For months, the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses, no physical evidence, and no suspects. Richard Evonitz continued living his normal life, going to work, maintaining his relationships, and appearing to be just another concerned community member horrified by the tragic murder of a local teenager. But privately, he was already planning his next attack. On May the 1st, 1997, 15-year-old Kristen Lisk and her 12-year-old sister Cotty were playing in the front yard of their Spotsylvania County home when Richard Evonitz drove past and spotted them. The sisters were everything he looked for in victims: young, vulnerable, and alone. He parked his car and approached them, likely using some pretext to gain their trust before forcing them into his vehicle at gunpoint. The disappearance of the Lisk sisters created an even greater panic in the community. Two children vanishing in broad daylight from their own front yard shattered any remaining sense of security that residents had maintained. Massive search efforts were launched, with hundreds of volunteers scouring every inch of the surrounding area. But once again, it was too late. 5 days later, the bodies of Kristen and Cady Lisk were discovered in the South Anna River, approximately 40 miles from their home. Like Sophia Silva, both girls had been sexually assaulted and murdered, and both had their pubic areas shaved. The similarities were too obvious to ignore. Police now knew they were dealing with a serial killer. The forensic evidence from both crime scenes was carefully analyzed and compared. Fibers found on the victims were matched, confirming that the same perpetrator was responsible for all three murders. But despite having established a clear pattern, investigators still had no idea who they were looking for. Richard Evonitz had been incredibly careful, leaving behind no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and no witnesses who could provide a description. For the families of Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters, the lack of progress in the investigation was agonizing. They knew their daughter's killer was still out there, possibly planning his next attack, while police seemed no closer to catching him than they had been on the day the first body was discovered. Community meetings were held, safety precautions were discussed, and parents began watching their children with a level of vigilance that transformed the once peaceful neighborhood into a place ruled by fear. But Richard Evonitz wasn't done. The successful completion of 3 murders had only increased his confidence and his appetite for violence. He began expanding his hunting grounds, traveling to other states and conducting surveillance on potential new victims. His job as a traveling salesman provided the perfect cover for these scouting missions, allowing him to visit communities across the country without arousing suspicion. In 1999, Evonitz moved from Virginia to South Carolina, but his relocation wasn't driven by any desire to stop killing. Instead, he was simply looking for new opportunities, fresh hunting grounds, where his previous crimes hadn't been publicized, and where local law enforcement wouldn't be on high alert for his particular methods. For 3 years, he continued his pattern of surveillance and planning. He drove through suburban neighborhoods in South Carolina, identifying potential victims, and studying their routines. He was in no hurry. The patience he had developed over years of planning had served him well, and he knew that the right opportunity would eventually present itself. That opportunity came on June 24th, 2002, when he spotted 15-year-old Kara Robinson in her friend's front yard. Everything about the situation fit his established pattern: a teenage girl alone, no adults around, in a quiet neighborhood where he could act quickly without being observed. He approached her with magazines, a simple but effective pretext that had likely worked for him before. But Kara Robinson was different from his previous victims in ways that Richard Evonitz couldn't have anticipated. When he forced her at gunpoint into a large plastic container in the back of his car, she didn't panic or shut down. Instead, she began observing and memorizing every detail she could about her abductor and her surroundings. She noted his appearance, his voice, his mannerisms, and even tried to keep track of the route he was taking. Evonitz drove Kara to his apartment, where he held her captive for 18 hours. During that time, he sexually assaulted and tortured her, following the same pattern of abuse he had inflicted on his previous victims. But throughout the ordeal, Kara continued gathering information. She memorized details about his apartment, noted personal belongings that might help identify him, and even managed to determine his first name. What happened next would change everything. While Richard Evonitz slept, believing his victim was too traumatized and terrified to attempt an escape, Kara Robinson managed to free herself from her restraints. She quietly gathered some of his belongings as evidence and slipped out of the apartment. Then she ran to the nearest house and called police. For the first time in his criminal career, Richard Evonitz had left behind a living witness. And not just any witness. Kara Robinson had provided police with more useful information than they had gathered from years of investigating his previous crimes. She gave them a detailed description of the perpetrator, his first name, information about his vehicle, and even directions to his apartment. Within hours, police had identified Richard Mark Evonitz and traced him to Sarasota, Florida, where he had fled immediately after discovering that Kara had escaped. When officers attempted to pull him over, he led them on a high-speed chase through city streets before running over spike strips that disabled his vehicle. Surrounded by police and facing a German Shepherd that had been released from a patrol car, Richard Evonitz found himself in a situation he had never encountered before. He was the one who was trapped and helpless. For years, he had held complete power over his victims, controlling every aspect of their final moments. Now the tables had turned, and he was about to face justice for the terror he had inflicted. But Richard Evonitz chose not to face that justice. On June 27th, 2002, 3 days after Kara Robinson's escape, he pulled out a .25 caliber handgun and shot himself in the head. His suicide ended any possibility of learning the full extent of his crimes or getting answers for the families who had waited years for justice. However, his death didn't end the investigation. Police obtained a search warrant for his apartment and discovered a locked footlocker that contained a horrifying collection of evidence. Inside were newspaper clippings about the unsolved murders of Sofia Silva and the Lisk sisters, handwritten notes about the crimes, and personal belongings that had been taken from the victims as trophies. The evidence was overwhelming and definitive. Kristen Lisk's fingerprints were found in Evonitz's car, and DNA evidence conclusively linked him to all three Virginia murders. Police also found materials suggesting that he had been planning additional attacks, including surveillance notes about other potential victims. But perhaps the most chilling discovery was a confession he had made to his sister shortly before his suicide. He told her that he had committed more crimes than he could remember, suggesting that Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters might not have been his only victims. Given that he had lived and worked in 26 different states over the course of his adult life, investigators began the grim task of reviewing unsolved cases across the country that might be connected to Richard Evonitz. The revelation that a serial killer had been living and working in their community for years left residents of Spotsylvania County struggling to understand how they had been so completely deceived. Richard Evonitz had attended community meetings about the murders, had expressed sympathy for the victims' families, and had even participated in search efforts. His ability to maintain such a convincing facade while systematically hunting children in the same neighborhoods where he lived and worked demonstrated a level of calculation and deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. For the families of his confirmed victims, Evonitz's suicide was both a relief and a source of frustration. They were grateful that he could never hurt another child, but they were also denied the opportunity to see him face trial and receive the justice their daughters deserved. The questions about his other potential victims would never be fully answered, leaving other families across the country wondering if their own unsolved tragedies might be connected to the man who had terrorized Virginia. Kara Robinson's incredible bravery not only saved her own life, but also brought closure to families who had waited nearly 6 years for answers. Her ability to remain calm and observant during the most terrifying experience imaginable, and her courage in escaping from a man who had already killed 3 other girls, prevented Richard Evonitz from claiming additional victims and finally exposed him for the monster he truly was. The case of Richard Mark Evonitz serves as a stark reminder that the most dangerous predators are often those who appear the most normal. He wasn't an obvious outsider or a clearly disturbed individual who stood out from the crowd. He was a military veteran, a working man, a neighbor who blended seamlessly into suburban communities across America. The psychological profiles of these killers reveal disturbing patterns that challenge our understanding of evil itself. What makes these cases particularly chilling is not just the brutality of their crimes, but the calculated nature of their deceptions and the systematic way they exploited society's most vulnerable members. David Berkowitz's transformation from the son of Sam Demon narrative to his later admissions reveals the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. His initial claims of demonic possession through his neighbor's dog provided a convenient framework for the public to understand his actions. It was easier to accept that supernatural forces drove him to kill than to confront the reality that an ordinary-looking man could harbor such destructive impulses. When Berkowitz later recanted his demon story, admitting it was fabricated, he exposed a more uncomfortable truth. He wasn't possessed by external forces. He was driven by rage, rejection, and a desire for notoriety that culminated in a year-long reign of terror. The psychological evaluation that diagnosed him as a paranoid schizophrenic adds another layer to understanding his crimes. His deteriorating mental state following his adoptive mother's death and the revelation of his illegitimate birth created a perfect storm of psychological instability. But thousands of people suffer from similar mental health conditions without becoming serial killers. What separated Berkowitz was his choice to channel his pain into violence against innocent strangers. His enjoyment of the media attention and the fear he created reveals a narcissistic component that went beyond mental illness into pure malevolence. The case of Gwendolyn Graham and Catherine Wood represents perhaps the most disturbing breach of trust imaginable. These women were entrusted with the care of society's most vulnerable members, elderly patients who depended entirely on their compassion and professionalism. Instead, they turned their workplace into a hunting ground, preying on victims who couldn't fight back, couldn't scream for help, and often couldn't even comprehend what was happening to them. Their initial plan to spell out murder with their victims' initials reveals a level of premeditation that is truly chilling. This wasn't a crime of passion or mental breakdown. It was a game, a twisted form of entertainment that they used to strengthen their romantic bond. The fact that they abandoned this plan only because it proved too difficult, not because they developed any conscience about their actions, demonstrates their complete lack of empathy or remorse. What makes their crimes even more horrifying is how they operated in plain sight. They boasted about their murders to colleagues, who dismissed their confessions as dark humor. This reveals a systemic failure in institutional oversight and a dangerous tendency to normalize inappropriate behavior in high-stress healthcare environments. The victims' families trusted that their loved ones were receiving compassionate care in their final years. Instead, these elderly patients became pawns in a sadistic game between two individuals who had sworn to protect them. The dynamic between Graham and Wood also illustrates how toxic relationships can amplify individual pathologies. Neither woman might have become a killer alone, but together they created a feedback loop of violence and depravity. Their need to impress each other and strengthen their bond through shared secrets led them to escalate from fantasy to reality. Even their method of taking turns performing the murders shows how they ritualized the killing process, making it a shared experience that bound them together in guilt and complicity. Patrick Kearney's 15-year killing spree represents one of the most methodical and sustained campaigns of violence in American criminal history. His ability to maintain a normal facade while systematically hunting, killing, and dismembering victims demonstrates a level of compartmentalization that defies comprehension. By day, he was a respected electronics engineer at Hughes Aircraft. By night, he was prowling highways and gay bars, searching for his next victim. Kearney's evolution from his first kill in 1962 to his eventual capture in 1977 shows how serial killers can refine their methods over time. .22 caliber pistol for quick, efficient kills, followed by necrophilia and meticulous dismemberment, created a signature that was both distinctive and difficult to trace. His disposal method of wrapping body parts in trash bags and scattering them across multiple counties was designed to frustrate law enforcement efforts to connect the crimes. The relationship between Kearney and his partner David Hill adds another disturbing dimension to the case. Hill's knowledge of some of Kearney's activities, coupled with his continued cohabitation, raises questions about complicity and willful blindness. The fact that Kearney's killing sprees often coincided with arguments in their relationship suggests that domestic tension served as a trigger for his violent impulses. This pattern reveals how personal dysfunction can manifest in horrific ways when combined with existing psychopathic tendencies. Kearney's confession to 32 murders, later reduced to 21 convictions, highlights the challenge of accurately accounting for serial killer victims. His detailed knowledge of crime scenes and disposal methods confirmed his guilt, but the true scope of his crimes may never be fully known. The fact that he operated for 15 years without detection demonstrates how effective predators can be when they target marginalized victims who might not be immediately missed. Francisco de Assis Pereira's crimes as the so-called rainbow maniac reveal how predators exploit societal dreams and aspirations to lure their victims. His tactic of posing as a modeling scout was particularly insidious because it preyed on young women's hopes for a better future. In a country where poverty and limited opportunities were common, the promise of a modeling career represented a potential escape from difficult circumstances. Pereira's background of childhood trauma and sexual abuse follows a pattern seen in many serial killers, but it cannot excuse or fully explain his actions. Millions of people suffer childhood abuse without becoming predators themselves. What distinguished Pereira was his decision to perpetuate the cycle of violence, becoming the monster that had once victimized him. His claim to be possessed by an evil force echoes Berkowitz's initial demon narrative, representing another attempt to externalize responsibility for heinous actions. The brutality of Pereira's crimes, including rape, strangulation, and distinctive bite marks, reveals a level of sadistic pleasure that went beyond mere sexual gratification. His consistent method of using shoelaces to strangle victims shows premeditation and a signature that helped investigators connect the crimes. The fact that he often left victims naked in public spaces demonstrates a desire to humiliate and degrade them even in death. The intensive manhunt that led to Pereira's capture illustrates how serial killer cases can mobilize entire communities and law enforcement agencies. His eventual confession and cooperation in locating additional remains provided some closure to families, but it also revealed the full scope of his depravity. His sentence of 268 years ensures he will never again have the opportunity to harm innocent people. Richard Evonitz's case demonstrates how predators can hide behind respectable facades while conducting elaborate campaigns of surveillance and violence. His military service and steady employment provided perfect cover for his criminal activities. The fact that he lived in Spotsylvania County during the time of the murders, yet avoided suspicion for years, shows how effective he was at maintaining his double life. Evonitz's signature of shaving his victim's pubic hair reveals a disturbing need for control and humiliation that extended beyond murder. This detail, found across multiple crime scenes, provided investigators with a crucial link between cases that might otherwise have remained unconnected. His systematic approach to victim selection, surveillance, and disposal demonstrates a level of planning that is truly chilling. The survival and escape of Kara Robinson represents one of the most remarkable examples of courage and presence of mind in criminal history. Her ability to gather identifying information while enduring sexual assault and torture shows extraordinary strength and intelligence. Her detailed observations provided investigators with the breakthrough they needed to finally identify and pursue Evonitz. Evonitz's suicide, when faced with capture, denied victims' families the opportunity to see him face justice in court, but it also prevented him from claiming more victims. His confession to his sister about committing more crimes than he could remember suggests that the three confirmed murders may represent only a fraction of his actual victims. The 26 states where he had lived and worked as a traveling salesman provide a vast geographic area where additional crimes may have occurred. The evidence found in Evonitz's apartment after his death, including newspaper clippings about his victims and their personal belongings, reveals the depth of his obsession with his crimes. Like many serial killers, he kept trophies that allowed him to relive his victims' suffering. The discovery of Kristen Lisk's fingerprints in his car provided definitive physical evidence linking him to the murders. These 5 cases illustrate different aspects of serial killer psychology and methodology, but they share common themes that reveal disturbing truths about human nature. Each killer demonstrated an ability to compartmentalize their crimes while maintaining relationships and employment. They all showed a preference for vulnerable victims who were less likely to be immediately missed or effectively defended. Most importantly, they all made conscious choices to harm innocent people for their own gratification. The investigation and prosecution of these cases also highlight the evolution of forensic science and criminal profiling techniques. DNA evidence, fiber analysis, and geographic profiling all played crucial roles in connecting crimes and identifying perpetrators. The cooperation between different law enforcement agencies and the use of media attention to generate leads show how modern investigative techniques can overcome even the most careful criminal planning. Perhaps most importantly, these cases remind us that evil often wears an ordinary face. The neighbors, co-workers, and even family members of these killers were shocked to learn of their crimes. This reality challenges us to remain vigilant and to trust our instincts when something feels wrong. It also underscores the importance of protecting vulnerable populations and maintaining robust oversight in institutions where power imbalances exist. The legacy of these killers lives on in the families they destroyed, the communities they terrorized, and the investigators who dedicated their careers to stopping them. Richard Mark Evonitz was a predator who perfected the art of deception, hiding his monstrous nature behind the mask of an ordinary man. Born on July 29, 1963, in Columbia, South Carolina, he appeared to live a conventional life. He served 8 years in the United States Navy as a sonar technician, earning an honorable discharge. He worked blue-collar jobs, maintained relationships, and blended seamlessly into suburban communities. But beneath this carefully constructed facade lurked a calculating killer whose crimes would terrorize families across multiple states. Evonitz's criminal behavior began early, though it took years for the full scope of his depravity to emerge. In 1987, he was convicted of lewd exposure in Florida, a seemingly minor offense that hinted at darker compulsions. After his military service, he moved to Spotsylvania County, Virginia in 1993, where he would unleash a reign of terror that would haunt the community for years. His first known victim was 16-year-old Sophia Silva, a bright teenager who had just returned home from school on September 9, 1996. Sophia was in her front yard near Loriella Park when Evonitz approached her. What happened next remains largely unknown, but Sophia vanished without a trace. Her family's desperate search lasted weeks, with volunteers combing the area and police following every lead. The discovery of her decomposed body a month later in a creek in King George County brought their worst fears to reality. The condition of her remains revealed disturbing details that would become Evonitz's signature. Her pubic hair had been completely shaved off, a ritualistic act that spoke to his twisted psychology. The Silva murder sent shockwaves through Spotsylvania County, but it was only the beginning. On May 1st, 1997, Evonitz struck again, this time targeting two sisters playing in their front yard. 15-year-old Kristen Lisk and 12-year-old Cottie Lisk were doing what children do on warm spring days, enjoying the outdoors near their home. Their parents were inside, unaware that a predator was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Evonitz abducted both girls in broad daylight, a brazen act that demonstrated his confidence and planning. The sisters simply vanished, leaving behind only their bicycles and the frantic screams of their parents. The community mobilized immediately, with hundreds of volunteers joining law enforcement in an exhaustive search. For 5 agonizing days, hope remained that the girls might be found alive. That hope was crushed when their bodies were discovered in the South Anna River, approximately 40 miles from their home. Like Sophia Silva, both sisters had been sexually assaulted and their pubic areas shaved, establishing a clear pattern that linked the crimes. The forensic evidence was limited, but fibers found at both crime scenes would later prove crucial in connecting the cases to a single perpetrator. The murders of 3 young girls in less than a year created an atmosphere of fear that gripped the entire region. Parents became hypervigilant. Children were no longer allowed to play outside unsupervised, and the community lived under a cloud of anxiety. Law enforcement worked tirelessly, following hundreds of leads and interviewing countless suspects, but Evonitz remained invisible, a phantom who struck without warning and vanished without a trace. What made Evonitz so dangerous was his meticulous planning and his ability to conduct surveillance without arousing suspicion. He would study his victims' routines, learning their schedules and identifying moments of vulnerability. All of his victims were under 18, fitting a specific profile that fed his twisted desires. He had a documented obsession with drowning and forcing his victims to wash or shave, ritualistic behaviors that satisfied his need for control and humiliation. For 5 years, the Virginia cases remained cold. Evonitz had moved to South Carolina, where he continued to live his double life, working various jobs and maintaining the appearance of normalcy. He even married, though his wife later revealed disturbing details about his behavior, including his collection of newspaper clippings about missing children and his unusual interest in young girls. Evonitz's carefully constructed world began to crumble on June 24, 2002, when he made a critical mistake. In Lexington, South Carolina, he spotted 15-year-old Kara Robinson in a friend's yard. Using his practiced deception, he approached her under the pretense of distributing pamphlets for a landscaping business. When Kara came close enough, he pulled out a gun and forced her into a large plastic storage container in the back of his vehicle. What happened next would prove to be Evonitz's undoing. During her 18-hour captivity in his apartment, Kara Robinson displayed extraordinary courage and presence of mind. While enduring unspeakable horrors, including sexual assault and torture, she meticulously gathered information about her captor and his surroundings. She memorized details about his appearance, his apartment layout, the sounds outside his windows, and even the serial numbers on his appliances. When Evonitz finally fell asleep, Kara seized her opportunity. She carefully freed herself from her restraints and escaped through a window, running to safety and immediately contacting police. Her detailed description of her captor and his apartment gave investigators their first real break in years. She had not only survived, but had provided them with the key to solving multiple cold cases. The information Kara provided led police directly to Evonitz's apartment, where they found evidence linking him to the Virginia murders. But Evonitz had already fled, triggering a massive manhunt that stretched across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts, tracking his movements and anticipating his next move. The chase ended in Sarasota, Florida, on June 27, 2002. When police located Evonitz's vehicle, he led them on a high-speed pursuit through city streets. The chase concluded when officers deployed spike strips, disabling his car. As law enforcement approached with a police dog, Evonitz made his final decision: .25 caliber handgun. The investigation that followed Evonitz's death revealed the full scope of his crimes. Inside were newspaper clippings about the unsolved Virginia murders, handwritten notes detailing his crimes, and personal belongings taken from his victims. Most damning of all, they found Kristen Lisk's fingerprints in his car, definitively linking him to the murders. DNA evidence further confirmed what investigators already suspected. Evonitz was responsible for the deaths of Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk, and Katie Lisk, as well as the abduction and assault of Kara Robinson. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, providing closure to families who had waited years for answers. But the investigation also raised disturbing questions about the full extent of Evonitz's crimes. Given that he had lived and worked in 26 different states as a traveling salesman, investigators began to wonder how many other victims there might be. The geographic scope of Evonitz's potential crimes was staggering. His military service and subsequent employment had taken him across the country, providing him with opportunities to commit crimes far from his home base. Cold cases in multiple states were re-examined, looking for connections to his travel patterns and methods of operation. What made Evonitz particularly dangerous was his evolution as a predator. His crimes showed increasing sophistication and brutality over time. He learned from each attack, refining his methods and becoming more careful about avoiding detection. His ability to maintain a normal facade while committing horrific crimes demonstrated a level of compartmentalization that is characteristic of the most dangerous serial offenders. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of a man driven by a need for absolute control. His ritualistic behaviors, including the shaving of his victim's pubic hair and his obsession with drowning, suggested deep-seated psychological issues that may have stemmed from childhood trauma or abuse. However, Evonitz took the secrets of his motivations to his grave, leaving investigators and psychologists to piece together the puzzle of his pathology from the evidence he left behind. The impact of Evonitz's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families of Sophia Silva, Kristen Lisk and Katie Lisk had their lives forever changed by his actions. The communities where he struck were left to grapple with the realization that such evil could exist in their midst, hidden behind a mask of normalcy. Kara Robinson's survival and her instrumental role in bringing Evonitz to justice became a testament to human resilience and courage. Her ability to maintain her composure during the most terrifying experience imaginable and to gather the information necessary to identify her captor likely prevented other young women from becoming his victims. The Evonitz case also highlighted the importance of forensic technology in solving cold cases. The fiber evidence that linked the Virginia murders, combined with DNA analysis and fingerprint identification, provided the scientific proof needed to definitively connect him to his crimes. These advances in forensic science have become crucial tools in the fight against serial predators who might otherwise escape justice. Today, law enforcement agencies continue to investigate potential connections between Evonitz and unsolved cases across the country. His methodology, victim profile, and travel patterns are compared against cold cases in the hope of providing closure to other families who have lost loved ones to unknown predators. The story of Richard Mark Evonitz serves as a chilling reminder that evil often wears a human face, hiding behind the mundane details of everyday life. His case demonstrates how predators can exploit the trust and innocence of their victims while maintaining the facade of respectability that allows them to move freely through society. The investigation into Richard Evonitz revealed a methodical predator who operated across state lines with calculated precision. What made him particularly dangerous wasn't just his ability to kill, but his talent for disappearing into the fabric of ordinary American life. After each crime, he would resume his daily routine, attending church functions, maintaining relationships with neighbors, even helping local police with community events. This psychological compartmentalization allowed him to function as both a helpful citizen and a serial killer without detection. The forensic evidence found in Evonitz's possession painted a chilling picture of obsession and ritual. Beyond the newspaper clippings about his victims, investigators discovered detailed maps marking locations where young girls frequently gathered, school schedules, and photographs taken from a distance of potential targets. His apartment contained restraints, sedatives, and a collection of personal items that suggested his crimes extended far beyond the confirmed cases. Most disturbing were the journals documenting his fantasies and plans, written in a code that took cryptographers months to decipher. Kara Robinson's escape represented more than just survival. It demonstrated the power of mental preparation under extreme duress. During her captivity, she forced herself to memorize every detail of her surroundings, from the apartment's layout to the serial numbers on appliances. She noted his routines, the sound of his car engine, even the brand of cigarettes he smoked. When the opportunity came, she didn't just run, she executed a plan she had been formulating since the moment of her abduction. Her testimony later revealed that Evonitz had discussed his previous victims, providing confirmation that he was indeed responsible for the Virginia murders. The multi-state investigation that followed Evonitz's death uncovered a web of unsolved cases that bore his signature methods. Police departments from Florida to Pennsylvania began reopening cold cases involving teenage girls who had disappeared under similar circumstances. His work as a traveling salesman had taken him through dozens of communities, and his military training had taught him surveillance techniques that made him nearly invisible to law enforcement. The scope of his potential crimes became clear when investigators mapped his known locations against unsolved disappearances spanning 2 decades. What distinguished Evonitz from other serial killers was his evolution as a predator. His early crimes showed signs of impulsiveness and panic, but by the time he reached Virginia, his methods had become refined and systematic. He would conduct surveillance for weeks before striking, learning his victims' schedules and identifying the optimal moment for abduction. His choice of dumping sites demonstrated geographic knowledge and careful planning, selecting locations where bodies would be difficult to find but not impossible, suggesting he wanted his crimes to be discovered eventually. The psychological profile that emerged painted Evonitz as a man driven by control and the need to possess his victims completely. The ritual shaving of his victims' pubic hair wasn't random violence, but a signature that served multiple psychological purposes. It represented his complete dominance over their bodies, his attempt to infantilize them, and a way of marking them as his property. This behavior, combined with his tendency to keep personal belongings as trophies, revealed a killer who needed tangible reminders of his power over life and death. The impact of Evonitz's crimes extended far beyond his immediate victims. The families of Sophia Silva and the Lisk sisters endured years of uncertainty, not knowing whether their daughter's killer would ever be caught or if he might strike again. The communities where he operated lived under a shadow of fear, with parents afraid to let their children walk alone and schools implementing new security measures. His ability to blend into suburban neighborhoods while harboring such darkness challenged everyone's assumptions about safety and trust. The technological advances that helped solve these cases marked a turning point in serial killer investigations. DNA evidence that was unavailable or unreliable in the 1990s became the key to linking Evonitz definitively to his crimes. Digital mapping allowed investigators to track his movements across multiple jurisdictions, while improved communication between law enforcement agencies ensured that patterns could be identified more quickly. The lessons learned from tracking Evonitz influenced protocols that are still used today in multi-jurisdictional investigations. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the Evonitz case was the revelation of how many opportunities existed to stop him earlier. His 1987 conviction for lewd exposure in Florida should have placed him on law enforcement radar, but jurisdictional boundaries and limited information sharing meant this red flag was overlooked. Neighbors later reported suspicious behavior that in hindsight clearly indicated criminal activity, but at the time seemed merely odd. The case highlighted the importance of taking seemingly minor sexual offenses seriously, as they often escalate to more serious crimes. The courage displayed by Kara Robinson became a beacon of hope for other survivors and families of victims. Her decision to speak publicly about her ordeal helped other young women recognize dangerous situations and trust their instincts when something felt wrong. She transformed her trauma into advocacy, working with law enforcement to develop training programs and speaking at schools about personal safety. Her survival proved that even in the darkest circumstances, human resilience and intelligence could triumph over evil. The death of Richard Evonitz by suicide denied justice to his victims' families and left countless questions unanswered. Investigators believe he was responsible for many more crimes than those he was definitively linked to, but his death meant that other families would never know what happened to their missing daughters. His case serves as a stark reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They sometimes look like neighbors, co-workers, and community members who have learned to hide their true nature behind a mask of normalcy. These 5 cases, David Berkowitz, Gwendolyn Graham, and Catherine Wood, Patrick Kearney, Francisco Diaz Pereira, and Richard Evonitz, represent different faces of evil that most people have never heard of. They remind us that serial killers aren't just the household names that dominate documentaries and true crime podcasts. They're also the forgotten predators who operated in shadows, the ones whose stories got buried beneath more sensational cases, and the killers whose crimes were solved too late to generate lasting media attention. These cases remind us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades, lurking in quiet neighborhoods and everyday interactions. From Berkowitz's reign of terror in New York to Evonitz's calculated predation across multiple states, these killers exploited society's trust and preyed on the vulnerable. While their names may not be as recognizable as other notorious criminals, their impact on victims' families and communities was devastating and lasting. The courage of survivors like Kara Robinson and the dedication of law enforcement ultimately brought justice, but the scars left by these monsters serve as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can exist within seemingly normal people